Hello everyone, Helen here. Welcome back into the Campervan. Today I'm going to take you on the third part of Phil and I's most recent trip to Scotland in the Campervan. And I'm going to follow the usual format of taking you on a tour of places that we went to and things that we did. But also I've got a kind of a bonus this time. I've got a special story for you at the end. And this is something to do with this trip, but I'm going to leave that till the end and we can get on with our journey right away without any further waffle. So let's get going, shall we? So far, we've travelled north from Durham, where we live, taking an indirect route to Oban on the west coast of Scotland. Last time I showed you around the Isle of Coll. And when I left you, we were just arriving on the nearby island of Tiree. We arrived on Tiree in the early evening, and when the ramp of the ferry slowly went down, we were directly facing the lowering sun. I love this first drive onto a new island, and I always find it fascinating that although a fair number of vehicles drive off the ferry, the islands rarely seem overrun with cars. I told you last time that Tiree couldn't have been more different to Coll, and the very first difference was the welcome we received. Although the warden who organises the Croft camping scheme sent a message to say she was unable to be there in person, she'd left us a lovely welcome pack, which contained all sorts of useful leaflets to help us make the most of our stay on the island, and instructions on how to find the locations for our camping spots. Tiree is definitely much more set up for receiving visitors, whereas Coll doesn't provide such an obvious welcome, although that's not to say they don't welcome people onto the island, although maybe they're just trying to preserve their beautiful tranquility. If you look on the Visit Scotland website, you'll find many places of interest to visit on Tiree, whereas only about 3 are named on Coll. We studied the map to check how to get to our first overnight spot on Tiree. Like Coll, Tiree doesn't allow people to make overnight stops wherever they please on the island, but has a system where you have to pre-book the places where you'd like to be overnight. They charge a nominal fee to cover the expenses of operating the scheme, but all of the spots are essentially wild, with no facilities as you'd get if you were on a proper campsite. We drove through the village of Scarinish, which looked clean and bright in the evening sunshine, and we were pleased to be driving close to the seashore. So another obvious difference between Coll and Tiree. On Tiree, almost every road we travelled on had a view of the sea, whereas Coll's roads mostly ran through the centre of the island, and the sea view was often hidden by huge sand dunes. Tiree is a very similar size to Coll, 12 miles by 3 miles, but has a population 3 times the size of Coll, so it has about 650 people living there instead of about 200 on Coll. We drove straight to our first overnight spot. We'd booked a different place for each of our 3 nights, and we found that we had a wonderful view over Crossapole Bay. When we woke the next morning, the sunshine of the previous day had vanished, and for the rest of the day the weather was very mixed and the sun didn't really come back until the end of the day. I washed my hair before we set off, and I promise you I don't actually do a video every time I wash my hair, but I just think it's fun to keep a record of the different places where I do, and this one with a bowl of warm water on the floor of the van is the most usual way. We left the overnight place after I'd spent a bit of time wrestling with the gate, just my usual problem with gates, and we set off for Hynish Heritage Village. to have breakfast in the little restaurant in Hynish, but it turned out that they weren't offering breakfast after all. So after a quick bite to eat in the van, we started exploring the village. The buildings here looked very different to the ones on the rest of the island, and that's because they were built by the Commissioners of Northern Lighthouses, which was later called the Northern Lighthouse Board. Initially, they were built to service the building of the Skerryvore Lighthouse, which is 11 or 12 miles offshore. The pier was built as a place to land the stone that was brought from the Isle of Mull. And they also built a harbour, and they had to build in a special mechanism to prevent the harbour from continually filling up with sand. And from here, materials and equipment would be transported to the small area of rocks where the lighthouse was being built. Other buildings here included stores and workshops and a blacksmith's smithy. Of course, there were facilities for the workers, including barracks for up to 100 men. And the buildings continued to be used once Skerryvore was a working lighthouse. We had a wander up to the flat-roofed stone cottages where the lighthouse keepers and their families lived. Each team of 3 lighthouse keepers did a shift of about a month out on the lighthouse before changing over with the second team. There were never any female lighthouse keepers appointed. According to the Northern Lighthouse Board, one woman bundled up with 2 men for 4 years on a place like Skerryvore was asking for trouble. We saw signs of the walled gardens where the families would have grown fruit and vegetables, and no doubt they kept some cows and sheep and hens too. I looked out in the direction of the lighthouse to see if I could spot it, and I did, though it was just a mere thin white pole on the horizon. And you can just pick it out on this photo here. Before the lighthouse was automated, the only way that messages could be exchanged between lighthouse and shore was via semaphore messages, and the signal tower here had someone on duty for 1 hour twice a day at 9 a.m. and 2 p.m, with both keepers and signalmen making use of powerful telescopes. A ball would be raised to the top of the flagpole on the signal tower to indicate that any messages from the lighthouse had been received and understood. It's said that if one of the lighthouse keepers' wives had given birth, the signalman in the tower would hoist an appropriate item of clothing to indicate the gender of the baby. We spent quite some time in the Skerryvore Lighthouse exhibition, which is housed in the building that was originally a blacksmith's workshop and a coal store. Initially, in 1838, a temporary wooden barracks was built out on the rocks, where the lighthouse was going to be built, so that 2 or 3 dozen men could stay there for weeks at a time. Although in the first winter, when the barracks was empty, a huge storm knocked it down, and a modified structure had to be built at the beginning of the next working season through the spring and summer, and this one thankfully survived throughout the building of the lighthouse. The engineer in charge of the lighthouse building project was one of the famous Stevenson family, most of whom were engineers. Between 1786 and 1938, Stevensons were responsible for building 156 lighthouses around the coast of Scotland. There was one notable exception in this family of engineers, and that was Robert Louis Stevenson, whose poor health meant that he chose an alternative career as a writer, and quite a success he made of that. Building of the foundations began in July 1840, when a ceremony to lay the foundation stone was attended by the Duke and Duchess of Argyll. They must have been hardy souls, going right out to that little bit of rock in the middle of the sea. It's actually the tallest lighthouse in Scotland, standing at 156 feet or 48 metres. Its foundations are built of a dark grey stone called gneiss, which is found in abundance on Tiree, and the rest of it used pink granite from a quarry on the Isle of Mull. The tower is built with 11 compartments consisting of a living room, bedrooms, storerooms and an engine room. Toilet facilities were extremely basic until the 1960s, and there were no modern shower facilities until 1980. Lighthouse keepers were not well paid, although Alan Stevenson did suggest that the Skerryvore keepers should be paid a bonus because of the remoteness of the lighthouse. They certainly had to work hard while they were on duty, but the living accommodation on shore was relatively modern and warm, and it was quite a lovely, close-knit community. It was lunchtime by the time we came away from Heinisch, and on our way to a cafe we stopped off at Becky's Bakes. This is a small bakery run by Becky and her mum in a separate kitchen right next to their home. It must be rather nice to cross the garden to get to work. There were all sorts of delicious cakes and cheesecakes for sale, and we couldn't resist buying a selection to take with us. We then headed for the village of Ballamartine to have lunch at the farmhouse cafe. Phil had chili on cheesy nachos, and I had a very tasty chicken wrap with extra bits and bobs to go with it. By this point we were feeling in need of a bit of resting time, so we drove to Gott Bay, a wide expanse of white sand near the ferry terminal. In the windsurfing world, Tiree is a real mecca. I read somewhere that it's almost as if someone with ultimate power has decided to design the perfect windsurfing island, because there are 9 white sand beaches, all facing in different directions to catch whatever wind and swell is available. And Tiree is also a pretty windy place. It was such a relaxing spot that once we'd had tea and a piece of cake that we'd bought at Becky's Bakes that morning, I actually slept for over an hour. Eventually, though, we tore ourselves away from Gott Bay because we wanted to go and visit a place called Coll to see a bit of archaeology that we'd read about. You can see as we drive along how much more open Tiree is than Coll, with wider swathes of green pasture land. Once we'd parked the van, we set off to walk to Dunmore Broch. After reading the rather weather-worn information board, you can see here an artist's impression of what this particular broch might have looked like. We walked across the occasionally boggy and often rocky ground, admiring some lovely flowers along the way. The rocks here are largely the same type that are found on Coll, the grey rock known as Lewisian gneiss, which I mentioned earlier when I was telling you about the lighthouse. I also paused to admire an impressive and really gorgeous lichen-covered rock. It was like some great hairy animal that was just asking to be stroked. So, of course, I gave it a little bit of a stroke. Dunmore once had walls that were about 25 to 30 feet high. That's about 8 metres, so it wasn't particularly tall, with walls about 12 feet thick. There was a staircase within the inner and outer wall that would have taken you up to 2 or 3 galleries or floors, and parts of staircases still remain there today. There's evidence that there was a pivoted door at the entrance, and that was situated right next to a small guard's cell, so someone would probably have been on duty there at all times to keep an eye on all the comings and goings of the broch. Whenever I come to places like this, my imagination instantly starts thinking about the people who were there at the time that the broch was built in the 1st century. People whose hands had laid these stones in position all those centuries ago, and who would have admired the same sea view that we have today. And I'm sure there would have been people sitting here around a warm fire, doing some crafts such as weaving and spinning, and they would be chatting and telling stories. It's not a huge living area, and it probably was fairly cosy with all the bodies in here helping to keep each other warm. Back in the van, we headed towards Scarinish because we'd spotted somewhere that we could fill up with water and also empty our grey water tank. We drove through some very heavy rain for a while, passing Tilly the turbine. This is a wind turbine that's been providing power for the whole of Tiree since 2009. The rain continued to come down rather heavily, but it didn't last too long, and we soon arrived once again in bright sunshine at the public facilities, including some excellent toilets in Scarinish. We also spotted a rather familiar cinema truck as we passed by Tiree's community centre. It was then time to head for our second overnight spot, which wasn't far from Hynish Heritage Village, where we'd been to in the morning. The overnight place was basically just in a remote field on a croft that had chosen to offer a bit of space to the croft camping scheme, with a lovely view of the coast. We were completely on our own here, and 11 miles offshore was the Skerryvore lighthouse, only just visible to the naked eye. Phil got out his camera and tripod and telephoto lens and managed to capture some quite clear photos of the lighthouse. So we were quite excited about that, since we now knew so much about how it had come to be. Later, once darkness fell, we could see the flashing of the lighthouse. It was just brilliant to open the van door onto such a wonderful view and feel in complete solitude and at peace. We settled down for the night once we'd had a light meal of oat cakes with some very tasty cheese and another piece of cake from Becky's Bakes. We woke up to beautiful sunshine and felt a deep sense of calm as we opened the van door. This is definitely one of the most tranquil places that we stayed in. People sometimes ask me if it isn't a bit of a hassle not having a permanent bed. You can see part of the process here, although I have sped it up a bit. We recently timed ourselves and found that at a leisurely pace it takes under 4 minutes to set up the bed at night and about 5 minutes to put it all away in the morning. Because now we've got a system, the process is very slick indeed and no trouble to us at all. Everything has its place, and in the morning everything is placed where we can access it all easily without even stepping outside the van, which is great if it's pouring with rain outside. On this morning we decided not to rush off into the day, and we thought we'd enjoy a leisurely breakfast, so we made some eggy bread, which I always love, with plenty of jam on top. As soon as we started to set off, the rain returned. I had to get out to open the gates so that we could leave the field, and for once I managed to open the gates without any trouble at all. It was quite a narrow grassy track with a few lumps and bumps, but Phil drove along carefully and we managed to leave without any mishaps. Soon the wind picked up and the rain started battering the van. we drove to Balafool Beach, and despite the rather wild weather, we decided to go for a little walk, remembering that well-known saying that was quoted by the writer of many walk books, Alfred Wainwright: "There's no such thing as bad weather, just unsuitable clothing." It's actually quite exhilarating being out in wild weather, as long as it's safe and you've got somewhere warm and dry to retreat to afterwards. Not surprisingly, there was no one else about, and we enjoyed walking along the beach, being buffeted by the wind, almost being blown over at times by the strong gusts, although we'd definitely have lingered there a bit longer if the sun had been shining. We decided to return to the place where we'd had lunch the previous day, the Farmhouse Cafe in Ballamartine, where Phil had a latte and some nice warm soup, while I had a hot chocolate and a brie and cranberry panini with salad. The rain started to ease off a bit in the afternoon, and we set off to explore another part of Tiree, passing an interesting collection of traditional houses similar to those we've seen on other Hebridean islands. We were looking for somewhere to spend the afternoon and drove onto a very lumpy parking area near the Maze Beach, one that's a big favourite with windsurfers. Phil decided to go off on a walk, while I wanted some quiet crafting time in the van. So I made a start on another crocheted zipped pouch, where you begin by sewing a row of chain stitches along the edges of the zip, and you then crochet into that. It's a very straightforward project, and lots of you will already have seen the finished pouches, and I'll leave a link to the pattern in the description box below this video if you fancy giving it a try. Phil had a lovely time taking photos on the Maze Beach, though there was no one out windsurfing, and I'd also asked him to take Pearl, the doll, with him to see if we could get some nice photos, and he didn't seem to mind if anyone saw him carrying a crochet doll about with him, and he did get some lovely pictures. I did go out for a little while and stretch my legs a bit on the nearest beach to where we were parked, Grinnell Beach, and that's supposed to be a very good place for beachcombing, especially in the winter months. Well, I never refused the chance for a bit of beachcombing, although I was glad that the cattle seemed to be completely ignoring me. I was a bit nervous about them. The sound of my footsteps on the pebbles was very calming, although I haven't included the sound here due to too much wind noise. And although I didn't spot any really interesting things to pick up, I was drawn to one very smooth white stone, which I brought away with me, and it's now living on my bedside table at home, reminding me of our lovely tranquil time on Tiree. As we drove further across the island, we couldn't help pausing at yet another beach, and we spent some time there appreciating the sunshine and the beautiful views, the sound of the waves, and observing other people enjoying the beach too, including somebody on a surfboard who was being kept a close eye on by her faithful dog. And that's where I'm going to leave you this time, with just one evening left on Tiree, and then next time we'll be heading away from the Western Isles up to the Highlands of Scotland. I can't wait to share that with you. But yes, we'll just have to wait a bit longer for that one. But I did promise at the start that I had a story to share with you, which was something to do with the trip that we went on. And it began when we were getting ready to leave to go to Scotland, and I happened to notice on the wing mirror of the passenger side of the van that there was a big spider's web. And when I looked closely, there was a little kind of stripy, brown and white stripy spider just peeping out from behind the mirror. And so I just left it. I don't generally clear webs away because I think the spiders need to catch their food. And I didn't think anything more of it though until we were just coming to the end of our time on the Isle of Coll. And we were waiting to leave, in fact, and the sun came out and loads of midges appeared, and I was sitting in the front of the van, and I happened to notice a flurry of activity in the wing mirror. And when I looked, there was loads of midges caught in the web, and the spider was going frantic, wandering all over the web, catching these midges. And I was going, "Go, spider, you catch those midges." So I thought, oh, that's amazing. And then I didn't think about him anymore. But when we got home again, so that was over 2 weeks later, and we were unpacking the van, I noticed that the spider was still there. I'm pretty sure it was exactly the same spider. And I thought, wow, what an amazing spider. You've been on adventures with us and you've come back. And so that just sent a little spark of inspiration going in my head. And I ended up writing a story poem about him, which I'm going to read to you now. And I named the spider Columba after Saint Columba, who founded Iona Abbey and was a bit of an adventurer himself. And so I hope you're going to enjoy the story. There's one little bit of poetic license, because the story is all true, apart from this one thing, which was I needed a particular rhyme, and instead of saying the Isle of Coll, I said the Isle of Tiree. Apart from that, everything else is true. The Unexpected Adventures of Columba. Columba was a spider who was looking for a place to settle down and spin a web, a simple sheltered space. With sleek brown legs and stripy vest, he sped along the ground and found a rubber wall that was lumpy, black and round. A little jump on string of silk, he climbed the slippery height, and when he reached the summit, a cave came into sight. Upon its lip he paused a while. At first he got a shock, for another spider stared at him, whose eyes with his did lock. "Oh, silly me," Columba laughed, "a mirror I can see, and just behind it I can crawl, the perfect home for me." Columba sighed with pleasure, a wondrous web he spun. His life as a travelling spider had only just begun, for little did he realise that his chosen place to stay was a campervan's wing mirror on a van soon on its way. Columba kept quite busy catching tasty things to eat until a whirl of movement caused the spider to retreat, and as he peeped from where he hid, he gasped in great surprise, saw humans bringing boxes of every shape and size. Several bangs and shudders as he shook from side to side. Columba froze in deadly fear, his terror amplified by a rush of blustery air and an engine's gentle purr. An unexpected happening. His home began to stir. Columba, in his hiding place, began to bounce and shake. Perhaps his world was ending with the mightiest earthquake. A hefty breeze blew past his ears, a world of green sped by. It took Columba all his strength to not sit there and cry. But at his heart Columba was a spider of great stature, whose bravery and fearlessness had filled him with adventure, and gradually he caught the sense of grandeur all around him. Forests, hills, and other things he really found astounding. Through valleys wide and mountains steep the van drove through the day, heading north for Scotland, took Columba far away. A breeze picked up. A salty smell came wafting by his nose. A new sensation, up and down, down, then up they rose. The van was on a ferry sailing o'er a choppy sea, and very soon they landed on an island called Tiree. The rain poured down torrentially. Columba had to hide. The humans too were tucked up warm, secure and safe inside. The wind howled wild and rocked both van and spider cave all night. Columba needed nourishment. His future wasn't bright. The spider's web was broken. He'd no way of catching flies. His tummy rumbled hungrily beneath the slate-grey skies. The weather foul, the wind and rain, it battered cave and van. Columba wondered sadly if his life was all but done. The next day dawned. Columba saw the storm begin to ease. the sky grew light, and he perceived a gentler, warmer breeze. Oh, happy day! The sun appeared. Columba started mending his tattered web, his tender life on silky strands depending. A busy time Columba had, when suddenly he noticed floating clouds of darkish brown, and when he really focused, saw the humans flapping arms and sounding rather vexed. The wind had dropped, the midges came. Columba was perplexed. A spider loves a midgie swarm, no problem in the least. On duty now, his web soon full, the time had come to feast. Midgie after midgie in Columba's web was captured, and the spider's heart and tummy were delightfully enraptured at the beneficial nature of the Scottish distribution of the juicy little beasties for a spider's constitution. While Columba sat contentedly, his tummy full and round, the van continued on its way to further places bound. To Scottish highlands, lonely isles and lochs and gorgeous glens, then home and reunited with his little spider friends. The humans in the van, one was short and one was tall, seemed to pay him kind attention, didn't threaten him at all. He was sure he'd heard them speaking several words of conversation on their feelings all about him and their pride and admiration. And the short one took his photograph and wrote his story down to be preserved forever in his home in Durham town. He'd seen the world, survived the storm, a comfy den he'd found. Adventured far in sun and rain, he'd travelled all around. Columba, like the humans, knew wherever he did roam, a little cosy campervan would always feel like home. So thanks ever so much for spending some of your time with me today. It's been lovely to have your company, and it won't be long before I'm back here again chatting to you and taking you on the next bit of the campervan trip. But until then, keep nice and busy, take great care of yourself, and I will see you again very soon. Okay then, bye.